4 years ago, when I first reviewed Assassin's Creed Valhalla, I employed what we call a visual metaphor, because I am, at my core, a pretentious twit. In the game, there are these doors that you need help from one of your crew to open, and at launch, the pathfinding for the AI was so tremendously terrible that you would very often find yourself bashing against these doors for minutes at a time, waiting for the AI to finally find their way to you. I thought this was the perfect visual representation of my experience with Valhalla, mindlessly bashing myself against the door, hoping that when I finally broke through, I would find something valuable. Something that made all the time I spent to get there worth it. But then, when you finally get inside, it's just a small amount of supplies that won't even build you a bakery. Nothing exciting, nothing noteworthy, just another box checked on an endless checklist. I had truly hoped that coming back to the game after all these years, I would find something different behind that door, something I had missed the first time. And to my shock, I did. I had to look real hard and bash in a hell of a lot more doors to find it, but there are glimmers of Assassin's Creed Valhalla that are genuinely great. I just wish it didn't take so bloody long to find them. Assassin's Creed Valhalla is a mess, sometimes in a good way, but mostly in a bad way. 4 years ago, I gave up on the game after about 30 hours because I was tremendously bored and honestly kind of offended by the game's approach to history. I don't think I ever would have finished the game if I hadn't committed to making this video. I am glad that I finally finished it, for completionist's sake if nothing else, but there are some genuinely great moments in Valhalla, some franchise highlight stuff. It's just that to get there you have to go through some of the longest, dullest storytelling and gameplay that I've ever put up with in any video game. Is 1 hour of great stuff worth 40 hours of boring drivel? No it isn't, which is why even if there is some stuff I like, I consider Valhalla to be the worst entry in the series. Valhalla is the longest game in the series, and maybe the longest game that Ubisoft have ever made. That size isn't inherently a problem. I'm generally okay with a game that I can really sink my teeth into. The problem is what that size is used to do. Nothing. Before I finished the game, I thought that door was the best metaphor for my experience with the game, but now that I've actually finished it, I have a better one. In 1995, dynamic duo Penn and Teller created a series of parody video games, and the most famous of which is a game called Desert Bus. It simulates the 8-hour drive from Tucson, Arizona to Las Vegas in real time. Miles and miles and miles of boring and empty digital desert. But hey, at least at the end of the journey, you're in Vegas, baby. Is Las Vegas a good place to be? Really depends on your mood, but compared to the endless desert, it may as well be paradise, or Valhalla, if you will. I did not enjoy my time with Assassin's Creed Valhalla, but by this time next month I'll probably have purged most of it from my memory anyway, like the in-between moments of so many a long road trip. You don't remember the hours going straight ahead on a highway, you remember the stops. But that's not my job right now. My job is to comb this desert for diamonds, so with ado further without, let's talk about Assassin's Creed Valhalla.
Children of gods, and heed my tale of time's beginning.
I think one of the biggest things working against my enjoyment of Valhalla is that it starts so strong. Valhalla is set in the midst of the Viking Age around 870 AD, and it's the saga of Eivor the Wolf-Kissed, Drengir of the Raven Clan. Like the last two RPG games, Valhalla once again starts with a smaller region separate from the rest of the game where you can get your bearings. This time that starting location is Norway, and it's probably the strongest opening chapter of the RPG trilogy. We open with Eivor as a kid, on the day her clan is supposed to be sworn to the local king. The village is attacked and Eivor's parents are killed. Specifically, her father surrenders, hoping to spare the lives of his family, but the big evil bad guy kills him anyway. 12 years later, and Eivor is still hunting that guy down, looking to redeem her family honour with a serious chip on her shoulder because she believes that her father died a coward. All of this immediately does a great job of putting you into the Viking setting and setting up Eivor as a protagonist. Norway is gorgeous and stark with its jagged snow-covered mountains and frozen oceans. It's a hard place to live that creates hard people, like Eivor. Valhalla has a much darker tone and atmosphere than Odyssey, and that creates a good contrast. Eivor is a much harsher and sinister character than Cassandra or even Bayek was. The first few hours set up important story thread after important story thread, moving at a surprisingly fast pace, especially compared to the slow starts of the last couple entries. Eivor's adopted brother Sigurd returns from his trips far overseas to the Middle East, along with two mysterious hooded individuals, Basim and Hytham. More importantly, Eivor has a vision of Odin and a vision of betrayal. She is fated to betray her brother. You manage to get revenge on the guy who killed your dad, but that in itself is only the opening gambit of several different chess games. For one thing, he was a member of the Order of Ancients, which is why the Hidden Ones are here, but for the other, he was the last violent threat in Norway, and now King Harald is making his move to conquer the very last kingdom, your kingdom, which Sigurd's father hands over willingly. Eivor and Sigurd, being traditionalist believers in Viking culture of glorious battle and honour, are outraged by this. So instead of bending the knee, they take half the clan and sail to England to start a new life. It all sets up such a promising story, mysteries to uncover, foreshadowing for future dramatic turns, and very clear character arcs to unfold. All of these things will come to pass, but it won't be for at least 20 more hours before we even start to come back to the things set up in these introductions. And it'll be at least 50 hours until we start resolving them. There are some red flags in Norway as to what the rest of the game is going to be like, but they're easy to ignore in the sea of rich narrative content. It's just as soon as you arrive in England to join the great heathen armies, everything comes to a grinding halt and never picks back up again. Once you arrive in England, you set up right in the middle of the map in a settlement you name Ravensthorpe. The rest of the structure of the game is about venturing to each region of the map to forge an alliance for Ravensthorpe by solving whatever problems are happening there. 16 regions, 16 problems, plus a few extra regions we'll get to. The reason it takes so long to come back around to these plot threads is that Assassin's Creed Valhalla doesn't have a linear story. Some of these regions will only unlock after others, but for the most part you can tackle these regions in any order, and outside of a few key regions they all tell independent stories. And the third of these regions is where I initially quit the game, not even a quarter of the way through, because medieval England is truly one of the most boring open worlds I have ever seen. There are degrees that contribute to what I will deem the Great Slog of Assassin's Creed Valhalla. There's a huge pile of petty things that build up to create an overwhelmingly tedious experience. It's hard to talk about Valhalla without comparing it to its predecessors because so much of what's annoying about the play experience of Valhalla is extra annoying because they're problems that were already fixed by the previous games. The choice of setting is one major issue. Medieval England is just about the most generic game setting it's possible to get. It's the default from which the entire fantasy genre is built out from. And other than being very pretty sometimes, there is absolutely nothing that sets Valhalla's England apart from any of the real or fictional depictions of the same environment. But a boring setting is only one part of the problem. It's what you do in the setting that really starts to make the whole experience drag to a crawl. I don't want to get bogged down with every petty issue that I have, but the petty issues are really important to the minute-to-minute experience of the game. Take, for example, the horse stamina bar. Your horse, along with your long shepherd, your primary way to get around the open world. But the horse has a stamina meter for sprinting, a stamina bar that only decreases if you're running off-road. Why? Well, it's a way to try and encourage you to stay on the roads. Why? The only possible reason I can think of is to extend playtime, to take you on a bigger, windier path instead of beelining it straight to the objective across open fields. Odyssey and Origins did not have a stamina bar for your horse. They let you horse climb all the mountains you wanted. It's added tedium for no good reason. The game is full of things like this, tiny little things that will detract from the overall experience that on their own don't sound like a big deal, but together start to be really annoying. Like having to go through the second dialogue screen whenever you enter a shop. This wasn't a problem in Odyssey. Summoning your horse now requires an extra flick on a radial menu that wasn't present in Odyssey. Same for pulling out a torch. Gameplay overall is just a lot less smooth than it was in Odyssey. Eivor maneuvers a bit like a drunk bear. There's a sluggishness to everything that just makes it slower. There's also a stamina meter in the combat now, which is a truly terrible fit with Odyssey's combat system. Odyssey's system was about rewarding aggression. A stamina meter is a system built to punish being too aggressive. All it does is slow down combat. Stealth is possibly the worst it's ever been in the series, which I'm almost okay with because stealth doesn't even make sense for Eivor as a character, but I think it's worth getting into anyway. Your options in stealth are severely limited, but also pointless. There is never an incentive to do things stealthily like the bounty system in Odyssey provided. You have a bird, a raven this time, but it doesn't do anything. It doesn't tag enemies or objectives or even chests. All it does is give you the general location of a quest objective. The bird is pointless now. Instead, you tag enemies with a ping that you can send out that doesn't highlight things with a nice clear white outline like before, but with weird abstract waves that are hard to see and harder to follow. It's very hard to tell which direction a guard is facing once they've been tagged, but again, stealth is pointless anyway. There are some areas of the game which try to bring back social stealth, and the system is so janky that it's almost impossible to do it right, but it will make Eivor pull up her hood when you enter the areas, which by default makes her walk even slower. And you have to manually pull the hood down again on the same radial menu as the horses and the torches. Levelling up has been reworked in a way as if to make it as unsatisfying as possible. Instead of actually levelling up, every so often you get 2 skill points to drop into this massive skill web, the vast majority of which are just tiny incremental stat boosts, and every 5 or so of those you follow will eventually lead to an actually useful skill. This approach makes levelling up an almost automated process. In fact, you actually can automate it by just hitting the central button. There's nothing exciting about levelling up, there's no real choice to it, there's no reason to even look at what the stat boosts are because they're so minuscule that it doesn't matter. There's nothing exciting about levelling up, it's just kind of a chore you have to do every so often to open up the menu and increase your power level by another 2 points. Skills and abilities are also separate now. You unlock abilities by randomly finding special books out in the open world, which means it could be literally 30 hours before you find an ability you actually want to use, and even longer before you can take it to its full potential. More time wasted having less fun than you could be having. You might be starting to get why all these minor annoyances just keep building and building on each other, but we're not done yet. Valhalla has a completely different approach to open world design, and in my opinion, it's a much worse approach. The open world is no longer based on locations, but on activities, and this is what absolutely ruins the sense of discovery that Origins and Odyssey were aiming for. Instead of exploring, it becomes checklisting. In the last 2 games, your objective is to add icons to the map, increase your understanding of the world. In Valhalla, your objective is to remove icons from the map, to clean it all up. The map is harder to read now, we've ditched the lovely satellite views of the previous games in favour of something more abstract, but more importantly, the icons have changed. Instead of question marks, there are these glowy pips in 3 flavours. The colour of the pip marks what category of activity you'll find there, which means there's no sense of mystery. You know exactly what you're going to find at a location as soon as you mark it on your map. There is no discovery. It is literally checklisting. There is a checklist at the bottom of the map tracking your progress in a region through this rigid system. And this would be fine if what you were doing was fun. It's quite similar to how the open world in Black Flag is structured after all, but unfortunately, in combination with what we've already talked about, it isn't. The 3 categories of things defined in the open world are mysteries, artifacts, and wealth, and all 3 of them are bad in their own fun and unique ways. Let's start with artifacts, which are in my opinion the worst of the 3. Within artifacts, there are about 5 different things you'll find. Treasure maps, which sometimes aren't actually maps, that will always lead you to a ship cosmetic. Saga pages, which are just a big wall of text. Tattoo designs, which function exactly like the pages from Assassin's Creed 3, only twice as annoying because of the drunk bear problem. Roman artifacts, which you can trade back at Ravensthorpe for settlement cosmetics. And finally, the absolute worst, Celtic cursed skulls, which are creating bad vibes in a location which you need to shoot to make the bad vibes filter over your screen go away. In case it wasn't clear, none of these are even remotely rewarding, they're just stuff to populate the open world with. The tattoo designs are particularly pointless because the vast majority of armour in the game covers your entire body, so you're never going to see 90% of the tattoos you unlock, which is great because they are by far the most annoying collectible in the game. Odyssey and Origins ditched collectibles entirely and were all the better for it. But this is a running thread throughout Valhalla, this desire to please absolutely everyone, which ends up creating an experience that is a diluted worse version of everything. This feels like older Assassin's Creed, but it's in a map 5 times as big as those games, which makes the whole thing much more tedious. You're riding 4 minutes to shoot a skull for no reward, to then ride another 4 minutes and cross a river to chase a page for a tattoo you aren't going to use. It's boring! It's really, really boring. Wealth has its own list of issues. There are 3 kinds of wealth, the knowledge books I mentioned before, as well as resources and gear. Valhalla ditches Odyssey's approach to gear, where you're constantly looking for better and higher level stuff, and instead focuses on permanent unlocks with their own upgrade system. This is theoretically more rewarding because permanent unlocks are generally better than temporary gear increases, but the result is actually the complete opposite. The upgrade system is tied to several soft locks so that your gear doesn't become a higher level than you. There are 3 tiers of upgrades tied to the resources you can find, and each tier of resource is only found at a certain level of region. What this means is that once you've gotten the 15 or so ingots you need to upgrade your gear to the current maximum tier, every other resource chest you find is completely pointless. Any new gear you find you're unlikely to use because you would need to invest a bunch of resources into bringing up to the equivalent of the gear you're already wearing. Mixing and matching gear is also discouraged because the armor sets are designed as sets and only give the bonuses if you're wearing the entire set, and you only get one piece at a time from these chests. It's a cascade failure of incentives that makes the whole thing worse and less worth doing the more you play, in a way that Origins and Odyssey never did. Because even the gear you had no plan to use still had a purpose, either monetary or for crafting resources. In Valhalla, like the artifacts, you're just doing it to tick them off the map. It's also worth noting that there is a shockingly low amount of variation in the little puzzles to get these collectibles, if you can even call them puzzles. You either have to find a key nearby, find an angle to shoot the lock on the door, or, the bane of my existence, carry an explosive jar to a place to blow up a crumbling wall, at which point you have to wait a few seconds for the fire to disperse before it's safe to actually walk through. One of these 3 things, every single time. Finally, there is the mysteries, which are the biggest mixed bag. Things like standing stones, cairns, and shrooms are just different mini-activities that reward you with a skill point, which, as discussed, is barely a reward at all. Some of them are boss fights, either against fellow Drangira in the wilds or special animals. Also some against evil witches, but we'll get to those later. Most of them are what they call world events, which is what Valhalla has instead of side quests. After experiencing all of these, I can safely say that 90% of them are total garbage, not worth the time to even talk about. So instead of going through all of them, let me give you a representative sample from one of the early regions in the game. 3 children ask you to play hide and seek with them, so you hide on a bush and put the controller down for 3 minutes until you win. A man called Degolus is pissing off his family because he won't bathe and makes it a point of pride to coat all of his arrows in cow shit. You have to remove the boxes of cow shit from his house and then force him to take a bath. A man has an axe stuck in his head and hasn't noticed. You have a quick chat with him about that and then take the axe out, at which point he dies. 2 kids are bragging about their grandfather's wallop. He can fell any warrior with a single wallop, so you challenge him to a fight and he knocks you out cold with a single wallop. A nudist has been kicked out of his nudist group for being too enthusiastic about his nudity, so he asks you to steal the clothes of the rest of the group so that they are forced to be nude forever. This is the template for every single world event in the game. Mind-numbingly boring, unbearably cringeworthy attempts at humour, baffling pop culture references, and very, very occasionally, like the guy with the axe in his head, something passingly interesting. Beyond feeling bored by these, I actually started feeling a sense of dread whenever I saw the icon on the map was another world event, because I knew it was probably going to be boring and or terrible. And with absolutely no tangible reward at all, except for the memories I'm cursed with, like 2 weirdos asking you to burn their house down because they get off on it.
What did it? I am as hard as Heimdall's tower!
Then ram me like the Valkyrin's gates and enter Valhalla! Take all plunder you want, Vikinger, and take us also and let the love hunger consume you.
A worthy addition to my brain, which I am more than happy to pass along to you. You're welcome. Not every side quest in Origins or Odyssey was a winner, but even the crappiest joke quest in Odyssey was a level above the stuff you see in these world events. The vocal performances are also all over the place. The performances in the main story are fine for the most part, but some of these world events lean so far into exaggeration that you're basically playing a Monty Python game.
Shoot! Shoot! Stay away from my castle! Away from my brood! My sweet feline kin! Shoot, you big old Dane!
There's even more too, a series of mini-games and extra activities like fishing and drinking contests and slam poetry, or an entire dice game called Orlog, which is supposed to be this game's answer to Gwyn, except it's much simpler, much slower, and just generally kind of dull. There is a certain mindset about games that more is good, time is money, and compared to other games at the same price point, Valhalla sure does consume a lot of time. However, when the majority of that time is boring, tedious, and feels designed to waste your time rather than do anything meaningfully interesting, then I think it's worth asking if the extra 50 to 70 hours all this stuff adds to the game is actually a positive. It's all optional, you can just ignore it, but you should just ignore half the game isn't exactly a glowing recommendation, is it? Besides, that would only be true if the other part of the game, the non-optional stuff, was dramatically better. but it isn't. If anything, it's worse. I can put up with a lot of crap for a really good story. I hate the gameplay in Dragon Age Origins. I've never once managed to make it feel fun, but I put up with it because it's Dragon Age Origins, one of the most in-depth and interesting RPGs ever made. On a minute-to-minute basis, Valhalla plays a lot better than Dragon Age, but it doesn't play better enough to make up for the cosmic void of storytelling that makes up the bulk of the game. I said that the game has no side quests, and that's true, with only a few exceptions, but on the other hand, the entire game is side quests. Once you leave Norway, there is no main story, not until the very end of the game. The non-linear structure of these regions and the fact that they can be mostly done in any order means that there is no connection and no sense of escalation. It's just a series of disjointed episodes, which would be fine if they weren't all the same thing over and over again. Let's just go over the first 5 story arcs so you can see what I mean. In Grant Bridge, you help the Viking Jarl Soma reclaim her city and uncover a spy in her ranks. In Leicester, you help the sons of Ragnar depose the king of Mercia and replace him with their own puppet king. In East Anglia, you help Oswald secure his kingship by marrying into a Viking family, securing his throne as a puppet king of the Danes. In Oxenford, you fight a revolution against the current regent to secure a Viking alliance with the revolutionaries. And in London, you help the 2 sheriffs of London stop a coup attempt after the regent is murdered. So, to boil that down, we have Viking Politics, Viking Politics, Viking Politics, Saxon/Viking Politics. Continue that pattern for the next 11 regions. Every region is about securing power in the region and putting down whatever opposition there is to the side that Eivor has chosen to support, usually the local Vikings. Sometimes one region will follow up on the characters introduced in another region, but that's rare. For the most part, every time you enter a new region, you're meeting a new cast of characters. This is a double whammy of problems, because most of these characters only last a few hours before you're on to the next group. You don't really get to know anyone all that well, and because there is such a ridiculously expansive cast of characters, it's very easy to forget who's from where and what their deal is. Especially since so many of them are what I would class as generic Viking dudes. Which one of these grizzled axe-wielding warriors is from York and which one is from Kent? Neither, I think. It doesn't really matter. This repetition is driven to absurdity by the game's severely limited pool of face models. Odyssey had this issue too, but it was mainly a side quest issue. Since this game has no side quests, it's a very common occurrence for 2 main characters in different regions to just have the same face. I started tracking specifically this guy because I thought the first time you see him he looks a bit like George Clooney, and I have completely lost track of how many times this guy comes up in the main story as a main character. But it truly reached absurdity when there was 2 Clooneys standing right next to each other, and I guess I wasn't supposed to notice because one of them is wearing a helmet. The repetition that I find personally insulting is Randvi, one of the most important characters in the game, essentially your second in command, who looks so much like Cassandra that you would have to assume that it's some sort of twist that they're related. But it isn't, they just use Cassandra's hair as part of the set slate of hairstyles for NPCs, you see it all over the place. I don't know if they expected me not to notice or if they expected me not to care, and I'm not sure which option I would find more insulting. There's a blatant artificiality to the world of Valhalla, and Cassandra's hair is really just a standout issue, where because of how much time I spent with Cassandra, the fact that the hair is just a repeated model sticks out like a sore thumb. The culminative effect is repetitive story arcs set in repetitive environments with not just similar NPCs but oftentimes the same NPCs over and over and over again with no actual plot progression for hours at a time. It is overwhelmingly boring. The only consistent character through all of this is Eivor, and unfortunately Eivor is one of the most unlikable protagonists in the entire series, including Arno. Eivor is a Viking's Viking. She's mean, cruel, short-tempered, revels in violence and murder, and longs for glorious death and deceit in Valhalla, none of which are particularly endearing character traits. She does grow and change eventually, but because of the non-linear structure of the story, there is no character arc across the game. She's pretty much the same as where she started until the very last chapters. She can't be too different across these middle chapters because you can play them in any order. Eivor's position in the plot is the real problem. She's a kingmaker, and all of these regions is always about politics. And this creates a bigger separation from the rest of the series than even Odyssey did, because you're no longer a champion of the people, you're a champion of the systems of power. The Hidden Ones and the Order of Ancients are a part of the story, but a very small part. The assassins ask for Eivor's help to hunt down the Order, but she doesn't have any personal grudge against them, she doesn't even disagree with their philosophy, she just doesn't really care. She has no interest in helping the common folk. Her only real philosophy is, fuck you got mine. She cares about growing and protecting Ravensthorpe, and beyond that she really doesn't care. Eivor is a kingmaker, but with no particular interest on who becomes king as long as they hold up their bargains and don't become her enemy. If Eivor doesn't have any personal interest in anything going on, then why should I? Well, because it's an RPG, obviously. Unfortunately, it's a bad one that offers very little in the way of player freedom, or even the illusion of player freedom. I can pinpoint the exact moment where I originally gave up on the game, or at the very least started rating my original review of the game. After finishing the second story arc, Ravensthorpe is attacked. You fend them off and manage to take a prisoner, at which point you're given a choice to spare the prisoner or execute him. Not being a bloodthirsty maniac, I chose to spare him, at which point this prick called Dag pulls out an axe and murders him anyway. It's a moment that completely breaks the core promise of an RPG right in front of you. Your choices do not matter, and Dag's entire plotline is a perfect example of this. Dag's whole deal is that he doesn't like you and thinks that you're trying to take over the clan while your brother is away. So you might think that killing the prisoner like he wants will appease him and make him trust you more, but it doesn't, because Dag's betrayal and attempt to kill you is an unavoidable story moment. So even as a subversive choice, there is no choice. Dag will be suspicious of you and try to kill you no matter what you do. There is no way to appease him. That's the plot that does carry throughout the game. The region plots are even less expressive, with only a couple of exceptions. You're a kingmaker, but rarely do you get to decide who gets to be king, and in the rare places you do, there's a pretty clear right and wrong answer. Odyssey's RPG mechanics felt excited. Limited, sure, but they felt like a creative choice that the writers really wanted to play with and see what they could do with. Valhalla's RPG mechanics feel begrudging, like the writers don't actually want to make an RPG but have to because the higher-ups are telling them to make one because Odyssey sold pretty well. It's trying to compromise between the people who don't like RPGs and want a more focused story and the new audience of RPG fans who want a strong RPG. And a compromised RPG is just the worst of both worlds. An RPG with no real choice and a linear story with no linear structure, it just becomes a haze of borderline incoherent storytelling. Eivor is a much more concrete character than Cassandra, with much more cemented beliefs and attitudes, but that makes her less interesting to roleplay. She often does things that I disagree with and do not want to do, and acts in a way that I would not like to act in. Because, really, as much as being boring is a big issue with the story, being boring is only the beginning. When things are boring, the mind wanders, and the mind starts to consider what you're actually doing during your time in England. I skipped over one side activity in the list of side activities because this one is really in a league of its own. Raiding, going a Viking, as it were. To upgrade and add to the settlement of Ravensthorpe, you need resources, and the primary way to get those resources is to go on a raid where you call the horns and charge into a monastery, kill all the guards and pillage all the tasty resources they have locked away. Don't worry though, you're the good guys, because the game doesn't let you kill civilians. You can burn their houses down and steal all their resources for yourself, but killing them, that would cross the line. This became a bit of a joke when the game first came out because it is very silly on the face of it. It's not that I want to run around killing civilians, it's just that when I'm charging into their homes to rob them blind and burn their village down, it doesn't feel like it should matter if some of them get caught in the crossfire. But it actually speaks to a core issue with the presentation of the entire story. Valhalla, at every moment, wants you to know that you are the good guy. You are justified in every action you take. And this has some major and very uncomfortable consequences. The Vikings were a hostile invading army who tore across England, raiding how they pleased for land and resources. They were conquerors. Assassin's Creed Valhalla puts you on the side of the invaders and presents you as the good guys. It does this in several ways, and not killing civilians is the least of them. The game presents the Norse raiders as morally correct in their raiding, because the Anglo-Saxons are wealth hoarders, keeping those precious resources for no reason other than greed. You can use the resources better than they can. Over and over again, the game goes out of its way to demonstrate the Vikings' cultural superiority over the Saxons, and even more so the Celts who currently live in England. The Vikings deserve the land more than they do. As you enter Grantebridge for the first time, you're told how the Saxons were squandering the city, but the Danes built it up in just a few years into a major trading hub in the region. They're just better at it than the Saxons. The exact language the game uses for this, consistently, is one of the biggest red flags I've ever seen, but I'm not supposed to take it as a red flag, I'm just supposed to take it. We're leaving Norway with the express purpose of pacifying England. Historian Brett Devereux has a great article on how all of this comes across that I will be pulling on from heavily here, but as an actual historian he can explain it more eloquently than I do. The game doesn't want you to feel bad when you do obviously bad things, like raiding a monastery, and in its attempt to make you feel good about the things you're doing, Assassin's Creed Valhalla presents one of the most loving, uncritical portrayals of colonialism that I have ever seen outside of actual propaganda. Let's mix up context for a second. Imagine a game where you play as a British general burning down Native American villages, stealing their resources, and then when it's done you get a pat on the back for clearing out all those smelly savages. If that game came out, it would rightly be called out as extremely uncomfortable and just generally awful. Well, the problem with colonialism isn't the colour of the people involved. The problem is the core philosophical idea that one group of people is more entitled to land and resources than another by virtue of their cultural and, yes, ethnic superiority. It's a very obvious design choice that the Viking characters absolutely tower over most of the Saxon characters. Over and over again, the Vikings are portrayed as honourable warriors who'd never renege on a deal, while the Saxons are weaselly, physically weak schemers who'll stab you in the back at the first opportunity and care about nothing more than their own wallet. Maybe the Tories really do have a point that you can hide racism if you just make the targets white British people. One of the only good guy Saxons who's also a capable warrior is revealed to be gay, which itself is used as further proof of Viking superiority, because Eivor is accepting of such things while the Christian Church would have him stoned to death. I am not saying that the Christian Church shouldn't be criticised or even villainised, especially in this era, but the game does that while at the same time glorifying the Vikings in a way that they really don't deserve. It creates this false dichotomy between the two groups, where the Vikings are just better at everything in every single way. Better fighters, better farmers, just better, more moral people. It's not true, not even remotely. One of the game's most obvious omissions is the complete lack of slavery. Vikings raided settlements, not just monasteries, settlements, for all the resources they were worth, and one of the biggest and most important resources was people, or thralls as they were called. The Viking slave trade made up a huge part of their entire economy. The Christians participated too, but the Vikings did it bigger and better. The evidence we have suggests that the Vikings were not kind slave owners either, but Valhalla doesn't want to engage with any of that history with a 10-foot pole. The word thrall is used a couple of times, and that's the extent of Valhalla's engagement with slavery, which, coming from the rest of the series, is extremely disappointing, because it's not just an effort to make the game less emotionally difficult, it's a deliberate sanitizing of history to paint the Vikings as better people than they actually were. The problem is, it doesn't work, because no matter how you sugarcoat it, there's just no way you can make me feel comfortable about the act of raiding. If anything, the effort to make me feel good about it actually makes it so much more uncomfortable than if they just let it be a bad thing, which it so obviously is. The obvious comparison here is Assassin's Creed 4. That game also had you in the position of a raider, but the historical framing and context there is completely different. That game fudged history by having you exclusively target the navy and not merchants, but that fudging is enough to feel a whole lot better about it because the British and Spanish empires were legitimately awful and are portrayed that way in the game. For their faults, which the game also gets into, the pirates did have a point about the cruel and oppressive systems of the empires. In Valhalla, you are the Empire, you're on the other side, and instead of being cynical about that, you're expected to uncritically buy into the propaganda about how much these peasants deserve to get their church robbed. The Vikings didn't exclusively raid churches, and they most certainly didn't participate in these Normandy-esque epic battles. They weren't a threat because of their big strong muscles and superior battle prowess, it was because of their mercilessness and their choice of targets. The Vikings targeted places that were undefended, so it was easy for them. They raided monasteries because they were undefended and full of pacifists. The game's portrayal of the Vikings as noble warriors always on the hunt for epic battles is problematic for an entirely separate host of reasons, which we'll get to, but it's also wrong. They were pragmatists. They did things as easily as possible and usually lost when they were forced to fight against an actual organised military. When people defend the historical inaccuracy in this game by talking about how all of the games fudge history, I don't think they realise just how much worse Valhalla is than any other game in the series. For what's probably the worst example in the game, at least to me, we need to take a trip to Gloucester. Gloucester is the only region in the game which puts focus on the Celts, beyond being scary pagan druids who curse places with magic skulls and dress up in deer antlers to fight you with magic. It's half a fun little chapter about Halloween and half some of the most ahistoric nonsense in the whole series. The plot of this region is about setting up the new alderman of the village because the current guy is going to burn himself alive in a wicker man in a few days as a sacrifice to the old gods. The origins of the pagan Wicker Man go all the way back to Julius Caesar, when he first wrote about witnessing the Gauls sacrificing people inside a giant burning wicker effigy, and it's generally agreed by most historians to be some nonsense that Caesar or someone close to him just made up. The practicality of stuffing people into a giant man made of wicker and burning it, beyond any of the weird ritual stuff, just doesn't actually work. Wicker is not a very strong building material, just ask the first little pig. Beyond that, Caesar's writings over 2,000 years ago is pretty much the only source we've ever found of this actually being practiced. And the validity of this claim becomes very questionable when you consider that at the time he was writing, Caesar was campaigning against the Gauls and conquering them. He had a vested interest in painting them as weird savages. And yet, here we are, burning a giant wicker man, 900 years after Caesar in an entirely different country. And why? So I can watch a man burn himself to death while thinking about how stupid and backwards these Celtic country folks are? That's the Celts. Don't even get me started on the Picts, the early Scottish people, who are presented as nothing more than scary shirtless barbarians north of the wall. Something that other people of the time certainly said about the Picts, but wasn't actually true. This isn't just wrong history, it's bad history. It's history with an agenda, a really, really bad one. We're leaning into these incorrect ideas about the peoples of Britain to paint them as weird and inferior to the invading Vikings, to create a world and a story where this time doing a colonialism is okay, actually. It runs completely contrary to everything that Assassin's Creed 3 was trying to do, which makes it especially weird that the game spends 2.5 hours doing a loving homage to Assassin's Creed 3 for no reason. After a certain point in the story, you're told that one of the Order of Ancients has fled far overseas to a place called Vinland, and Eivor should go there to take him out. Vinland is the old Viking name for America, and the whole chapter is playing on this whole thing about how Vikings were actually the first Europeans to discover America, even if the real historical evidence isn't for another 150 years. It's completely disconnected from the rest of the main game. It really feels like DLC, even though it isn't. And for those exact reasons, it's probably my favourite chapter in the game, because it's finally a break from the endless Viking politics. You can't bring your inventory with you, so you have to scrape by with just what you can find, and more importantly, what you can barter with the locals for. The game treats the early Mohawk and Iroquois people with the exact same care that Assassin's Creed 3 did. The whole chapter even directly ties back to the plot of Assassin's Creed 3. Eivor comes across a glass orb, the same orb that will eventually send Raton Hageddon on his quest to join the Assassins. You can even find the door to the Great Temple. All of the Mohawks speak their own language, just like in Assassin's Creed 3, so Eivor and the few other scattered Vikings cannot understand them, and vice versa. There's a really intricate balance to the scenes here, where most of the actual conversation has to be done non-verbally, with gestures and facial expressions, each side trying to guess what the other side is trying to say. You do not kill any Mohawk people while you're in Vinland. You work alongside them to find the evil Viking, and then you leave after a little cultural exchange where you tell each other stories. It's nice. It's a sensitive portrayal of the Mohawk that clearly values their culture. Because of course it is. Ubisoft knows that you have to be careful around depictions of Native Americans because they're a real-life minority group in the present day. Unlike Celts and Saxons and Picts, which are groups that don't really exist anymore, unless you're a football fan. It's incredibly frustrating because I really like Assassin's Creed 3, and clearly the developers of this game also really like Assassin's Creed 3, but they don't seem to be able to put together that were Connor around, he would murder the shit out of Eivor for all the stuff you do in this game, and he would be completely justified in doing so. At its best, Ravensthorpe is supposed to capture the same magic as the Homestead in Assassin's Creed 3, a community that you grow over time full of friends and family, a place where Eivor can be comfortable and at peace. It fails because most of the people around Ravensthorpe are shallow characters with just a little bit of backstory and then some kind of gameplay function. There is no sense of community building like the slice-of-life missions that Assassin's Creed 3 provided. A couple of residents, like the baker, get a quest, but by the end of it you're building houses for people you never even meet and who have no lines of dialogue. But even if there was a whole community of lovable NPCs, Ravensthorpe is built on rotten foundations. The Homestead was an idealistic version of what America could be, by design. The American dream in action. A place where people are free, happy, and work together for the betterment of the whole community. Connor was a part of that community, but he never claimed to be or wanted to be the leader or the most important part of it. Ravensthorpe is a place built entirely to serve Eivor's needs, where she eventually becomes Jarl, and it's built on bricks and wood stolen from the people who used to live there. It's the colonialist fantasy, the kingdom of you, where everything bends to your whims and you are always right no matter what horrible things you do. The fact that the Hidden Ones are happy to set up a bureau here does not speak well to their judgment in this era. The game's portrayal of Viking culture generally is really dodgy. It's obviously a heightened, exaggerated version of history and Viking aesthetics, just like all the games are, but there are issues with doing that to the Vikings specifically, which nobody on the creative team seems to have considered. The look of the Vikings in this game, for example, has very little basis in historical fact, with the face tattoos, the multiple layers of fur, and the undercuts. It's more rooted in the Vikings TV show, which itself is very dubious with history. They don't have horned helmets, but this is in no way what Vikings actually look like. It is, however, what the neo-Nazis who've adopted Viking signifiers and culture as a return to the old ways look like. And I'm not saying that's a reason to give the neo-Nazis Vikings, but it's a good reason to be careful in your portrayal of Vikings so that you don't create a game which is basically Nazi propaganda. I mean, let's look back. This is a game where a group of big, strong warriors led by a blonde-haired, blue-eyed super soldier invade and conquer a land of weak, feminine dandies, and are continually justified and proven right in their actions at every single opportunity. This isn't subtext, this is the text. The truth is, the neo-Nazis are not pulling this Viking connection from nowhere. They're wrong about the Norse being a historical example of beautiful ethnic purity or whatever shite they say about Vikings, but there is an overlap between Viking philosophy and Nazi philosophy. The dogmatic belief in Valhalla is more than a little similar to what Umberto Eco described in his essay Ur-Fascism as the Cult of Death. Valhalla is the afterlife in Norse mythology reserved for warriors who died in battle, the Hall of the Slain. It's a bit more complicated than your regular afterlife because the warriors aren't going there to retire and spend eternity relaxing. They're being recruited by Odin to train and eventually fight alongside him at the dawn of Ragnarök, essentially the Norse apocalypse. The general idea is that to get into Valhalla, a warrior has to fight with honour, bravery, and die with a weapon in their hand, a specific detail which the game takes comically literally multiple times. The idea that the only way to get into Valhalla is to die in battle inspires a rather unhealthy attitude towards death and towards fighting. You can't go to Valhalla if you don't die in battle, so you better make sure you're participating in a whole lot of battles. If no one is battling you, then you better go looking for a fight. This is exactly how the game treats the desire for Valhalla. Entry to Valhalla is based on endless bloodshed, and if you're too good to die, that's an issue. One of the mysteries to be found around the map are the old Drengir of Ragnar Lothbrok, old Vikings who've outlived their time on the battlefield and ask you for one last fight so they can die with honour. In other words, suicide by proxy. One of these specifically has you kill an old man in front of his son because he'd rather die by a sword than on his bed. It's not necessarily my place to judge this attitude. Death in the Middle Ages was a whole lot more common and inevitable than it is today, and a quick death would certainly be preferable to a long, slow death by disease or starvation. The issue is with what this obsession with death inspires. To quote Eco's 11th feature of Ur-Fascism, everybody is educated to become a hero. In every mythology, the hero is an exceptional being, but in Ur-Fascist ideology, heroism is the norm. This cult of heroism is strictly linked with the cult of death. In non-fascist societies, the lay public is told that death is unpleasant but must be faced with dignity. Believers are told that it is the painful way to reach a supernatural happiness. By contrast, the Ur-Fascist hero craves heroic death, advertised as the best reward for a heroic life. The Ur-Fascist hero is impatient to die. In his impatience, he more frequently sends other people to death. This attitude is perfectly embodied by what's probably my most hated character in the whole game, Ivar Ragnarsson, or Ivar the Boneless. Ivar was a real historical figure who shows up in several Norse sagas, but according to this game, he's the Viking Joker. You first meet Ivar torturing a man to death, something which doesn't seem to faze Ivar even in the slightest. She's making jokes about it. Ivar is a violent sociopathic sadist who loves murder. He's an embodiment of the crass nonsense that the game seems to find funny, and he's also Eivor's friend. Even if you openly disagree with everything he does at every opportunity, the first chapter with him will always end with some fun bonding with Captain Warcrimes because this is a bad RPG. In his second appearance, he murders the King of the Britons' brother as part of a personal vendetta to ruin peace negotiations and make sure a war begins. When it seems like that war is about to stop, he secretly murders one of your allies, the Prince of Mercia, to ensure that Eivor is sufficiently motivated to continue fighting. Once you capture the king, Ivar performs a blood eagle on the king, an extremely brutal and historically debated ritual where the victim's ribs are torn apart and their lungs are splayed. Thankfully, the game knows better than to show it on screen, but he does this while the victim is still alive, so you can hear the screams. After all of this, he demands to fight Eivor to the death as either a final test of his own glory or a quick trip to Valhalla. And Eivor is reluctant to do it until he reveals that he's the one who killed the prince, which means Eivor is honour-bound to kill him. Ivar is a villain, that much is apparent, but what makes him a villain is that he's a traitor. Literally everything else he does, including the violent torture and the splaying of a man's insides, are a-okay with Eivor. Oh, she isn't a fan of him and she's clearly enjoying turning a man's insides into a bird, but the practice itself is not seen as any sort of red flag. Sometimes you gotta turn a man's insides outside in honour of the gods, it's just one of those cool Viking things. Once you beat Ivar, you're given the choice of whether to grant him or deny him Valhalla by not giving him his axe. I denied him what he wanted because he's a violent sociopathic asshole who I hate and doesn't deserve anything nice. And the game treats this as the selfish, immoral option, because what's important is that Ivar was following his own sense of honour. This is similar to the game's lack of slavery. The game is completely unwilling to interrogate and question Viking culture and presents all of it as uncritically good and positive, or at the very least neutral. And I do not understand why. The games have never been shy about criticising the negative aspects of their respective cultures before now. Going back just one game to Odyssey, Cassandra was a Spartan, and the game certainly indulged in the spectacle of Spartan warriors a bit, but it also didn't shy away from pointing out the parts of Spartan warrior culture that were inherently fucked up, like slavery, or their brutal training, or their habit of dropping unworthy babies off of cliffs. Ivar isn't a bad guy because he subscribes to a belief structure that demands endless violence and war. He's a bad guy because he did endless violence and war to one of the good guys instead of the bad guys. Valhalla is the name of the game. You would assume that this stuff would be central to the plot of the story, and eventually, at the very, very end of the game, we do circle back around to this, but it's too little too late after 70 hours of uncritical acceptance of this worldview. Ubisoft repeatedly stated that one of their primary goals with this game was to show a more holistic view of Vikings, to show them not just as violent barbarians, but as people with a rich culture, diverse society, and deep spirituality. In their attempt to show the Vikings in a better light, they end up uncritically adopting all of the terrible parts of Viking culture that genuinely do warrant criticism and condemnation. To ditch the Valhalla stuff for a while, another reason Vikings have been co-opted by neo-Nazis is because of their cultural position as these ultimate bastions of masculinity. Big, strong, hairy warriors who love drinking, murder, and sex. They take what they want and they do as they please. Valhalla plays into these tropes completely unironically, creating, just like everything else, an idealised version of toxic masculinity where you can do all of these things, but it's fine because only bad people get hurt. Playing as a woman does shockingly little to change how this comes across. If anything, it's worse. Female Eivor is a strong woman by way of removing almost all of the signifiers of her womanhood. She's a very manly woman who acts exactly like all the men. And that's what makes her a strong woman. It's this clever trick of progressive misogyny. Eivor is shown to be a better, stronger woman than any of the Saxon women in the game because she acts more like a man and adopts all of these aggressive masculine signifiers just as well as all the boys do. The baked-in assumption there is that these masculine traits are better than feminine traits, and it applies to all of the Lady Vikings in the game. The East Anglia arc specifically has the weak and feminine Oswald marrying a Viking warrior woman who towers over him as a way to emasculate the guy even further. He can only live up to her manly man standard once Eivor has taught him how to bite a guy's neck in the bloodlust of combat. I don't think Ubisoft intended any of this. I really, truly do not think that the writers of the game were trying to create Nazi propaganda. I think that they think the Vikings TV show is really cool and then just stop thinking about it any further than that. It's a vapid approach to history that says a lot of harmful things without consideration. Just like Odyssey, Valhalla includes the option to play as a man or a woman, and it has all the exact same problems as Odyssey down to it being true, again, that Eivor is canonically a woman. But I hashed all that out in my Odyssey video, so I don't want to beat that dead horse again. What I find more interesting this time is that as long as they keep presenting the choice, they need to keep coming up with convoluted explanations for why you have a choice. And what they settled on for Valhalla is unquestionably the most interesting part of the game. After a while in England, the clan seer comes to join you and to help Eivor delve further into her visions. Once you do, you wake up in Asgard, home of the Norse gods, in the shoes of Odin, although he's called Havi in these sequences for reasons I've never quite figured out. Odin actually appears throughout the game at pivotal moments to chat to Eivor, a sort of wise mentor figure on her shoulder. This is the explanation for why you could choose between a man and a woman. It's because Eivor is in fact two different people. Eivor Vansdottir, the Viking, and the Norse god Odin, or rather the ancient Isu Odin, reincarnated into Eivor just like the sages of the earlier games. You can actually change gender at any point in the game if you want, although I'm not really sure why you would. The recommended, and in my opinion best way to play it, is to let the animus decide. That means that everything in the real world you'll be female Eivor, but inside the visions, when acting as Havi, you'll be male Eivor. It creates a cleaner distinction and shows that you're playing as two distinct characters. It's not too hard to figure out what's happening here, which is good because the game never spells it out to you, leaving just enough clues that you can put it all together. Eivor's visions of Havi are distorted memories of the true history, filtered through the lens of Norse mythology, where all the sci-fi mumbo-jumbo of the Isu is hidden beneath a layer of magic and mysticism. Like Vinland, the 2 chapters spent with Havi are highlights of the game because they're another lovely little break from all the Viking politics. Havi is told of his fate at the end of Ragnarök, which is that he will be killed by a wolf, Fenrir, the son of Loki to be specific. And this is completely accurate in Norse mythology, but what makes it so special is that Ragnarök also happens to translate perfectly to what we already know of Assassin's Creed mythology. The catastrophe that destroyed the world and wiped out the Isu. It's a match made in heaven. Mythologically, Odin is a lot closer to Loki than he is to Thor, which you're probably most familiar with from the Marvel movies. Odin is a trickster figure primarily characterised as having an unlimited thirst for knowledge, including the knowledge of how to cheat his fated death, which is what both chapters of the Havi plotline are all about. Unlike Eivor, the game understands that Havi is kind of a selfish, arrogant asshole and allows that to come into sharper focus as the story unfolds, which makes it a lot more interesting and a lot less annoying to play. After trying and failing one method of survival in Asgard, he travels to Jotunheim, the realm of the Frost Giants, to find a special mead that will somehow allow him to live on past death. Where Asgard is a magic coat of paint on the real Isu of the game world, Jotunheim is even more fun as a long-time Assassin's Creed fan because it's full of familiar faces that become clear as you pay attention and joyfully realise, oh, that's Alethea, that's Juno, and if that's Juno then this must be Minerva and Jupiter. Odin didn't really venture to the realm of the Frost Giants, he ventured to the realms of Italy and Greece to pay a visit to the Isu we're familiar with from all the previous games. And this special mead is the same technology that Juno used on her husband that causes him to reincarnate over and over again. It's by far the most interesting way that mythology has been integrated into these games, because it's like a big puzzle for the player to figure out, an entire sequence of the game that you explicitly cannot take literally. All of this also directly ties back into the main story. Once you've been through enough prerequisite boring Viking politics, this stuff is folded back in, because Eivor is not the only reincarnation of an Asgardian running around. Her brother Sigurd is a reincarnation of Tyr, the Norse god of justice, and most importantly, Basim, the mysterious assassin, is a reincarnation of Loki. This really amplifies the repeating faces issue I mentioned earlier, because repeating faces is actually a hugely important part of the story. But Freya and Thor both use generic NPC faces, so is this lady a reincarnation of Freya? No, it's just a very stupid design choice. It becomes quite annoying that Eivor never figures this out, even when you have, but Eivor's vision at the very beginning that she's going to betray her brother wasn't actually a prophecy, it was a memory of something that already happened. Odin betrayed Tyr by knowingly letting Fenrir bite his arm off so he could chain the wolf. Sigurd also loses his arm during the story, and this is something the game does a lot, repeating events and echoes. Eivor is the wolf-kissed because she is Odin, who was fated to die to a wolf. The weirdest echo, though, has nothing to do with any of this reincarnation stuff. There are 3 major cities in the game which count as their own regions: London, York, and Winchester. The region quests for each city are still about Viking politics, but it's also where the Order of Ancients takes centre stage. Each city has 3 targets, and every single one of those targets is a direct callback to Assassin's Creed 1. The Merchant King, the Archer, the Healer, all of them have a direct counterpart here in Valhalla. There's a very famous quote from the behind-the-scenes features of Star Wars The Phantom Menace, where George Lucas, while trying to explain his creative visions, explains that it's like poetry, they rhyme, in reference to the fact that The Phantom Menace directly calls back to scenes in A New Hope. This quote has been a meme in the Star Wars fanbase for decades at this point, because saying it's like poetry just isn't actually an interesting creative ambition. It's easy to make things rhyme, we do it all the time, it's an art form well past its prime, and that doesn't make it a crime, but it's worth asking why we're bothering. The 9 city targets rhyme with the targets of Assassin's Creed 1. But why? Is Assassin's Creed Valhalla symbolically a reincarnation of Assassin's Creed 1? Hell no! It should be pretty obvious by now that the 2 games have nothing else in common. Eivor isn't learning lessons from these kills like Altair was. They rhyme, but there is no meaning in the rhyming. The reincarnation does have a purpose. It's about breaking these rhyming patterns and creating something new. But as for the rhyming assassination targets, it just feels like a reference for the sake of a reference. It's like poetry, but it's not actually poetry. For almost 2 hours, not actually the last story arc of the game, but the climactic story arc of the game, things do actually become really good. Sigurd is haunted by visions of a place back in Norway, the doorway to Valhalla, and so you go there with him to discover it together. When you get there, you find something much stranger, the tree of Yggdrasil, or at least a highly advanced supercomputer in the shape of a tree which Eivor and Sigurd are violently plugged into, awakening in Valhalla. Here is where the game finally addresses that the promise of Valhalla is a crock of shit, and that Odin is not a good guy. His advice has been getting worse and worse over the course of the game, but now it becomes apparent that he is a hostile force trying to take over Eivor's body and mind. But you can't fight him on his terms. Odin subscribes to the Viking philosophy of honour, glory and bloodshed, so to fight against him you have to drop your axe and run away. Choose life. I wish this beat had been built up to and incorporated things like Eivor's death. Instead it all revolves around her father's death 100 years ago at the start of the game, and Eivor's acceptance that he wasn't a coward like she'd always believed. But even then, it is a genuinely great, visually and interactively interesting sequence, blending mythology, sci-fi and personal character arcs in a fascinating way. It just happens about 50 hours after the point where it should. Eivor rejecting Valhalla and choosing life and family over endless battle is the point where Eivor finally becomes a somewhat likeable character. But it's too little too late here at the very end of the game. Eivor is choosing to move on and embrace the future. Basim is stuck in the past and forces a fight for the wrongs done to him 70,000 years ago. Eivor still doesn't understand why, but the player does. This is where things also fold into the modern day plot. Layla is back again, and this time she's at least sort of interesting. Her fashion scarf is black now, which is how you know she's been going through some shit since the last game. But more importantly, Sean and Rebecca are here to try and recapture the vibe of the earlier Assassin's Creed games. Outside of the beginning and the end, there really isn't any modern day sequences in Valhalla. Instead, there are animus anomalies around the open world where you switch to Layla for a minute to uncover an ancient Isu video like the Adam and Eve video from Assassin's Creed 2. A glimpse at the reality of the Asgardians without the mythological filter. Because Valhalla is trying to please everyone and bring back bitter and jaded classic Assassin's Creed fans, the modern plot ties directly back to Assassin's Creed 3. When Desmond touched the magic ball, he triggered some kind of magnetic field shift, which is causing environmental issues now, 8 years later. The magic ball was linked to the Yggdrasil device Eivor found, and so Layla has to take the Staff of Hermes down there to turn it off. This is where some true bonkers nonsense happens, because Layla plugs into the device and meets Basim in there, who Eivor and Sigurd managed to trap down there 1200 years ago. But more importantly, she meets a glowing golden man who sounds a whole lot like Nolan North, and she agrees to stay in the simulation with the mysterious golden figure to help him find the solution to another upcoming apocalypse. This means she's going to die because the room in the real world is full of radiation that she was only surviving thanks to the staff. But Basim wakes up and takes the staff to revive himself, damning Layla in the process. So Layla now gets to join Desmond as a digital ghost in the Isu computer simulation. That was the fate that it was all building up to last game. And frankly, I'm not that fussed because, it's Layla. What's much more interesting is that Basim takes over the player 1 spot now. As revealed in Jotunheim, Alethea is Loki's wife. She used Cassandra and Layla to get to this moment where she and her husband could be together again, and now they have their own unknowable agenda. If it seems like I'm just explaining stuff now, that's because that's just how the game is structured. The plot is all piled right at the beginning and right at the end. In the middle is a bunch of boring, repetitive nonsense with fascist overtones. If the game had cut all of that crap out and told a tighter 20 to 30 hour story with a narrative focus on the actually interesting parts, then it might have been one of the best games in the series. But a few hours of good storytelling does not counterbalance 70 hours of terrible storytelling. The actual final story arc can't be played until after all of this. It's the final strike on Wessex, the final place to conquer before England is pacified. But because it's all after this stuff, Eivor is now jaded and cynical about war and violence. So this very last arc of Viking Politics at the very least strikes a tone of cynicism, which is a whole lot more likeable than anything else in the game. War and violence aren't noble. Warriors don't ascend to Valhalla, they just die a pointless death. If the game could have struck this tone from the beginning, then it would have been so much more interesting and so much less offensive. But the commitment to the non-linear structure of the story means that would be impossible. So instead, we get 70 hours of uncritical acceptance of Viking culture closed off with 2 hours of middling cynicism. It's not enough, and it certainly doesn't carry over to the DLC.
Hi, traveller, and welcome to Discovery Tour Viking Age. Just like the brave Scandinavians who left their homes on longships in search of new horizons, a quest for knowledge and a promise of adventure awaits you.
I was honestly quite excited for Discovery Tour this time around, not because I'm eager to learn, but because the base game's approach to history is so tremendously awful that I was really curious to see how they'd approach turning it into an educational product. The result is a real dead dove in a paperback situation. It's really boring! I don't know what I expected. Valhalla takes a new approach to the Discovery Tour mode, where this time it has an actual narrative. Not one that's particularly worth getting into, mind. It's the sort of narrative you would get in a documentary or a museum demonstration. Extremely shallow and really only there to walk you through a bunch of educational checkpoints. Classic edutainment stuff, really. I personally find this much less engaging than the freeform exploration that the previous Discovery Tours provided. I like walking around museums, but I don't particularly enjoy sitting down for the demonstrations. Because let me tell you, the daily life of a Christian monk in the 9th century is not riveting gameplay. This narrative approach also highly condenses the game world. You can see from the map view that pretty much none of the map is used outside of the areas where the quests take place, which doesn't shock me because so much of the map this time around is built for purely gameplay purposes. It's not as if all of the identical monasteries you raid are based on anything specific other than the general idea of a Middle Ages Christian monastery. There's just not that much to discover in this Discovery Tour. When it comes to the ahistorical stuff, they will just flat out tell you when they're being wrong. Yeah, this abbey is 200 years early and in the wrong country, but we picked it because it looks cool, which, fine, I guess, at least they're honest about it. It's entirely possible that for some people this narrative approach is more engaging than the aimless wandering of the previous games, but I am at my heart a wanderer, and if I want to go on a tour of the perfumery, that's my choice, damn it. It's just not for me. Now might be a bad time to reveal this tidbit, but I actually don't care that much about Vikings, in case that wasn't extremely obvious by now. I have no particular fondness for the era or the culture, and Valhalla's main story did absolutely nothing to change that. I suppose I should have disclosed that bias, but I also didn't care about the American Revolution or ancient Greece before I played those respective games. Assassin's Creed has often been my gateway into history, and even after all the hours I've put into it now, Valhalla has never sparked my interest in the Viking Age. That's a shame, because Valhalla wasn't just the longest game at launch, it also got the most expansive post-release support in the whole series. Even putting some actual live service games to shame with 2 full years of post-release updates and expansions to the game. It's a lot. It's so much. Help me. A lot of the smaller free stuff that was added isn't available anymore because it was seasonal, a small quest chain for Christmas and Halloween where everyone in Ravensthorpe would throw a party or whatever. However, there are some permanent additions as well, the least of which is river raiding, a system for endless raiding after you've dried out all of England proper. I think I've made my position on raiding in this game pretty clear by now, so this already doesn't appeal to me on that front, but it's also worth noting that the raiding minigame is just kind of tedious. The reliance on waiting for the AI so you can open doors and chests is just annoying, so you run in, kill everyone, bash in a few doors, and then run back to your ship and sail down the river and repeat the process. I'm sure you can sink a lot of time into this mode, but I'm just not sure why you would. As far as I can tell, this mod is only here to justify the Jomsviking system, a really weird feature where you can customise your own Viking to serve on your longship. You can also recruit other players' Jomsvikings onto your ship, but they take up a spot that can be better filled by an actual character recruited over the course of the story. There's also no system in place to recruit your friends' Jomsvikings, you just have to hope you get lucky and they spawn. I never did, so no silly Saint 14 Destiny crossover Jomsviking for me. Mastery challenges are exactly what they sound like, medal-based high-difficulty trials to test your skill. There's a quick crossover mission with Assassin's Creed Mirage, which I assume will make more sense once I've played that game. Please don't spoil the surprise for me. The bonus seasonal stuff that I found the most interesting are what they call Tombs of the Fallen, which are a series of underground dungeons scattered around the base game. They provide the actual puzzle design that was totally absent from the base game, similar to the old tombs from Assassin's Creed 2. The final one of these is also just kind of funny in a sad way because Eivor meets a hologram of an Isu scientist who looks suspiciously like a modern-day game developer called Rasselise. And when it's all over, you get an in memoriam for a narrative director who died during development, Russell Lees. Very subtle, you guys.
Ireland, a patchwork of petty kings jostling for hills and pastures and green glens. My adopted isle.
The first major DLC for Valhalla was Wrath of the Druids, and if you thought the base game's depiction of the Celts was a bit dodgy, then oh boy, strap in. Well, that's not completely fair. In fact, in general, this DLC is an improvement over the storytelling in the base game. It's still more king-making politics, but this time we're doing Irish politics, which are slightly more distinct and interesting than Viking politics, especially since the game shows a whole lot more respect to the Irish than it ever did to anyone in England. Really, it's just an extra big region to add to the region quests of the base game, but on that scale it's better because it tells a slightly longer and more conclusive story with characters that are much more distinct and stronger written. Eivor initially comes to Ireland to visit her cousin Barid, who is now King of Dublin. Ireland had a lot of kings, so it's not as prestigious as it sounds. The game uses Barid to explore something that the base game only vaguely hinted at, which is that during this time period the Vikings were converting to Christianity en masse. Partly for political power, it made it much easier to rule over the local Christians if they accepted their culture and customs. But also partly because of all the Norse beliefs that I talked about before. Christianity offers a very different perspective on life and death to Old Norse beliefs that the visiting Vikings started to find a lot more appealing. The Norse pantheon has like 5 separate war gods, and the big G isn't generally a fan of war. I can certainly see the appeal. This makes a massive difference in the portrayal of cultural clashes from the base game. Wrath of the Druids has a lot more respect for the Christian position than the base game ever did. It's not shy about the dark sides of medieval Christianity either, but it's moved beyond painting them all as weak-willed cowards who are inherently inferior to Vikings, so that's nice. Barid isn't a full-on convert. Like most people in this transitional era, he follows a strange mix of both belief systems, the best of both worlds. This is where something that annoys me about all of Valhalla's DLC rears its head. Something I've always appreciated about previous DLC in the series is that they're usually set after the main campaign, and can therefore incorporate everything that happened in the main game. This is my preferred type of DLC expansion because it's accurate to how most people will play a DLC expansion, in release order as they came out months after the base game. None of Valhalla's DLCs, except for the very last one, are written like this. They're written so that they can be played whenever you want, and therefore cannot call back to the lessons Eivor has learned by the end of the base game. By the end of the base game, Eivor has literally fought Odin and rejected the entire Norse belief system. It's something that should have a profound impact on how she sees the world and approaches situations. But it can, because we can't assume that players have done all that yet. At the core of Wrath of the Druids is a clash between 3 cultures, and how exactly to resolve that clash. The Vikings, the Irish Catholics, and the Irish Pagans, or I guess specifically the Druids. We'll get to it. Eivor should have some strong opinions about this, but she doesn't because those strong opinions would be vastly different depending on when you play the DLC. The Catholics, led by High King Flanchina, are destined to be the rulers of Ireland, and that offers a choice for the other groups: adapt or die. The Vikings adapt, choosing Christianity and pivoting from raiding to building up Dublin as a trading hub. This is a whole mechanics-driven system that replaces Ravensthorpe for the DLC, liberating and reclaiming various trading posts around the map to start producing trade resources that you can send overseas for various rewards. Your point of contact for this system is Azar, a one-eyed, gender-fluid merchant from Persia. I don't have any problem with the gender-fluid aspect, even if it's only mentioned in her database entry and never comes up in dialogue. It's just that in general this character feels completely ridiculous, like someone's super cool OC please do not steal. With her badass, laissez-faire, casually insulting king's personality, her edgy backstory, and her amazing merchant/combat/spy skills. It's silly to the point where you would have to assume she's based on a real person, because what else is she doing here in this Irish DLC about druids? I really don't have a problem with diversity and inclusion in these games. People have been moving around and questioning their gender since the dawn of time, and I see no issue with representing that in the game. I do have a problem with how it comes across in the base game, because Ravensthorpe's diversity is yet another way that the game portrays the Vikings as superior to the Saxons. They're just more inclusive and welcoming than those bigoted Brits. But the DLC doesn't have that issue. Azar is just too cool and badass to be a real human being. Even if she was Irish and cisgendered, the problems would still be there. The fact that she's a gender non-conforming Iranian in Catholic Ireland and nobody even considers this worth commenting on is just icing on the cake, especially in a DLC that's at least partly about religious oppression. I really don't like the attitudes that go into arguments about pandering and woke agendas or whatever other criticisms are thrown against Azar and other characters like her. Even if that was their reason, I don't see those as inherently negative reasons. I would like to assume that Ubisoft put this character in the game because they were sincerely trying to create an interesting character, and on that front I give them a D-. Oh, also you get the resources to upgrade these trading posts by raiding monasteries, because we're still doing that apparently. But at the very least, the focus this time is on building up a joint Irish and Norse trade network and not just being a leech on the locals. This causes a hilarious bit of ludonarrative dissonance when Flann Sinna is unwilling to trust Barad because of a band of Vikings have been raiding monasteries. But he's not talking about you, he's talking about this other Viking who's arbitrarily worse than you for reasons. The other side of the cultural clash is the Druids, who choose to fight against Flann Sinna, specifically a group of super evil Druids called the Children of Danu. And this is where we get back to historical authenticity taking a nosedive. Valhalla's Druids draw more from Dungeons and Dragons than they do from any actual history. The look of Druids in this game, covered in mud, bones and deer antlers, is just pure fantasy nonsense. Most Druids look like this, just boring old men, not mysterious bog witches. And let's not forget the werewolves. Druid magic is real in Valhalla in a way that simply cannot be explained by sci-fi jargon like the previous games could. I already talked about the bad vibe skulls in the base game, which have absolutely no explanation other than magic being real. At least the werewolves only show up in areas affected by this green fog, so I suppose the implication is that the green fog is causing hallucinations, which is a real catch-all, we can do anything, don't worry about it solution. But, you know, what is the green fog? How do the Druids control it? Why do different people see the same things in the green fog? It's pure fantasy nonsense stacked on top of pure historical nonsense. The game paints the Druids as a major force in Ireland and a serious threat, even though by this point Ireland has been Christianised for hundreds of years. And in fact, Ireland is known for the way it merged Catholic and pagan traditions in a much more peaceful way than the rest of Europe. There were Druids serving in Irish monasteries. The game is inventing an entire conflict where there wasn't one just because it thinks Druids are cool and spooky. Your main point of contact for the Druids is Kira, an Irish poet voiced by a very Scottish folk singer who I don't even think is attempting an Irish accent. Kira is a fine character, but her place in the story is nonsensical. She's shown to be Flann Sinna's closest advisor and point of contact for all things Celtic, when in reality this divide just wouldn't have existed. Once you've dealt with all the scary evil Druids, the Council of Catholic Kings decides to form an inquisition to hunt down or convert all Druids in Ireland, and this makes Kira very upset, so she activates the Hill of Tara and uses it to have a magic boss fight against you, which at least this time is more clearly some kind of Isu thing. The fact is, I don't think the DLC needed Druids at all. Flann Sinna is an interesting enough figure on his own without this added fantasy Druid aspect. His quest to unite Ireland, and particularly his relationship with Barad, are more than enough to drive the plot. All this stuff with the spooky forest people is easily the weakest part of the narrative. I do still think Wrath of the Druids is an improvement over the base storytelling of the main game, even if that's a low bar to clear, but we've certainly not escaped the clutches of Valhalla's worst impulses.
Francia, the land of Charlemagne, and the bitter price of Ragnar, who sacked Paris for a fortune in silver and sorrow. Now a new king rises, uniting Franks against Norse in open battle, and casting angry eyes toward England.
The second major DLC expansion is the Siege of Paris, and it's probably the most consistently good part of Valhalla, setting aside the next DLC. Like Wrath of the Druids, it's just another big region of politics and king-making, but with a much more compelling narrative, and, for the first time in the whole game, some RPG decisions that someone actually thought about. The DLC centres around a major historical event, the titular Viking Siege of Paris from 885 to 886, with Eivor playing a central part in the siege and the surrounding political situation. This is chronologically after the events of the base game, it's meant for high-level players, and the DLC does portray a slightly more cynical and battle-weary Eivor, but it still doesn't commit all the way just in case someone wants to play it early. Since we're in Paris, the DLC also takes time to pay heavy homage to Assassin's Creed Unity, which is a bit like when two failing musicians start a band together to try and save their career, but still, the DLC does benefit from mining nostalgia a little bit. The game didn't bother with any Syndicate homages in London because the city is unrecognisable from its Victorian counterpart, whereas the foundations of Paris are similar enough to how they are in Unity that we can have a little more fun with these illusions. The atmosphere of the DLC is a country at war with burned fields and poverty run rampant. It hits a similar vibe to the French Revolution and a similar colour palette. One of the main characters of the DLC, a French rebel called Pierre, is actually voiced by the same guy who voiced Arno. Turns out he can do a French accent. Better late than never, I suppose. But the most important and most interesting callback to Unity is a game design callback. For this DLC, Valhalla brings in the assassination missions that were introduced back in Unity with the same UI and everything. And if anything, it actually does better by the system than Unity ever did, with unique kills that are easier to pull off and opportunities that are more apparent. Your targets are given about as much depth as they were in Unity, but that just completes the homage, doesn't it? From a role-playing perspective, what makes the DLC interesting is that it treats Eivar's role as Kingmaker with some gravitas for once. Eivar initially comes to France because of an impending threat from the current King of France, Charles the Fat. Really, that's what he was called. A Viking named Tolka comes looking for Eivar to recruit allies in a fight against Charles before he can kick the Danes out of France and start conquering England. And that's where Eivar's interests lie, in keeping the French out of England, not in helping the Danes stay in France. For the first half of the DLC, you're working for both sides trying to prevent a conflict and by extension, meeting all of the relevant figures on both sides. Each side is balanced with a bad leader who's currently in charge and a better leader who doesn't want to be in charge. The Vikings have Siegfried, a man who clearly cares more about revenge for his brother than protecting his people to the point of murdering women and children if they happen to be French. And they have his niece Tolka, who does care about protecting her people but lacks the confidence and especially the battle prowess to lead the clan. The French have Charles, one of many mad kings, openly hostile, manipulative, and just generally an awful human being. I mean, he is a king. And they have Count Odo, a French noble who tries his best to act as honourably as possible inside a corrupt system. Despite both being the obvious bad choices, neither Siegfried or Charles are completely without their sympathy and humanity. Siegfried is a broken man. The death of his brother shattered his belief in the gods or in justice, and now all he has left is pure, unending rage. You can put him down, or you can let him try and heal. Charles is a sick man. He has a declining mental condition that manifests, as he perceives it anyway, as a demon lurking within him. It's not the most sensitive portrayal of a split personality disorder I've ever seen, but it's still a complication on your judgments of him. How much can you hold the man accountable for his own actions knowing that he's mentally unstable? He also has a son, an illegitimate son, but a nice boy who would probably make a pretty good king one day. If you kill Charles, then you deprive the kid of ever having that opportunity. There are historical correct answers here. In reality, Odo did succeed Charles as King of West Francia after the siege, but I still appreciate the attempt at providing more compelling roleplay options this time around. What's most shocking to me about this DLC is that Eivar actually manages to be somewhat likeable in it for most of its duration. Her characterization in this DLC as being tired and cynical of war and bloodshed make her immediately more sympathetic than her attitude across the majority of the base game. Where in the base game she was all about singing songs of glory, her attitude now is much more pragmatic. She wants to avoid a war if she can help it and doesn't want to kill people unless she has to, like when she spares Odo towards the end of the siege because she feels he could still be a valuable ally. It's not the honour-bound, glorious Viking thing to do, but it is the right thing to do. The game world and the story echo Eivar's sentiment. War is hell. Not only is it draining the life out of all of France, and especially Paris, it's brutal and graphic, and there is no glory to be found there. Just death and destruction. If the whole game had hit this tone, then yeah, it would have been a real bummer, but it also would have been so much more interesting and so much more honest about what the Vikings represented to the people of England. The DLC is still bogged down by the same boring open world design and a whole new system of procedurally generated missions where you help out the French rebels, but it really does just show how much an interesting story elevates the whole thing. I'm much happier to overlook bland design if the plot is interesting.
Volker was right. Randvi! No. Cassandra. And you are?
I listen to a podcast called Mostly Nitpicking. It's hosted by Nando V Movies and a couple of his friends. One of the hosts, Chris Diggins, has a rule about media. Don't remind me of the better version of the thing inside the thing. And I think that rule applies perfectly to this next DLC. The 2-hour adventure where Cassandra shows up and completely steals the show. This is the other half of the Odyssey crossover free DLC thing they did, and just like Corfu, it's a whole extra expansion taking place on the Isle of Skye. This sets it up for me to like it on 2 fronts. It's the only time that the series has ever gone to Scotland, and so I get to feel all nostalgic for my family holidays up to the Scottish Isles, which this game perfectly recreates in all their stark beauty, even if for some bloody reason everyone on the island is English. What is this, France? Secondly, the DLC stars Cassandra, a character I care infinitely more about than anyone else in all of Valhalla. When I say it stars Cassandra, I really do mean that. This is fully a Cassandra story. Eivor just happens to be here along for the ride. The whole chapter is elevated by Cassandra's presence, because she brings along with her the better writing of Odyssey, and in general her light-hearted tone and wit that was so desperately missing from the dreary slog of the base game. Cassandra is now over 1,000 years into her hunt for Aesir relics, and she's come to the Isle of Skye because she's heard of an apple of Eden here. The apple is causing everyone on the island to have nightmares, very specific nightmares, always about an eagle somehow ruining their life. As the DLC goes on, this gets more and more specific. The islanders start calling out Cassandra directly as the Eagle Bearer and then eventually taunting her in ancient Greek. Her arrival on the island is what activated the apple and started the nightmares. Oh, also Eivor is here because some lady asked for her help. Actually, the game makes it an entire plot point that Randvi looks like Cassandra, which I almost admire the audacity of, even if I still think it was a ridiculous design choice. Eivor comes to the island because the seer thinks she sees Randvi in her visions when really she's seeing Cassandra. Everything about the way Cassandra is portrayed in this DLC is immediately so much more compelling than Eivor, and when it ends I'm just left with the feeling that I wish she could take me with her. The last 1,000 years have changed her. She's a little more reserved and a lot more socially awkward than she used to be, having spent so long on her own at this point. But she still has the same easy wit and love of sarcasm that she always did. In fact, she spends most of their time together poking fun at how self-serious Eivor is. The way the DLC plays with your foreknowledge of Cassandra is excellent. There's one moment specifically where Cassandra stops mid-conversation as if listening to something. Just a weird, meaningless moment if you don't know her deal, but if you do know, it's obviously Alethea chiming in to say something that only Cassandra can hear. When you use your Eagle Vision ping on Cassandra, she breaks it and blears out with a magic golden light, because as far as it's been shown by this point, she's essentially a being of pure energy, or at the very least, obviously not a normal person anymore. Something magical and celestial. There's a quiet melancholy to Cassandra now, and despite her sassiness towards Eivor, it becomes clear very quickly that she's actually quite happy to have someone to talk to after so long on her own. She's clearly out of practice in dealing with people, but Eivor, being the blunt instrument she always is, brings out the old Cassandra again. As they approach the apple, it starts spitting out projections of Cassandra's memories, the memories it had been giving to all the people on the island of her past in Greece. And when she sees the carved eagle that Phoebe the orphan once gave her, she's stopped in her tracks, kneeling down to stare at it for a few moments. Her past is so incredibly distant now, and it's something she's probably not even thought about for hundreds of years, but it all comes flooding back at the sight of it, and she just needs a moment. It's one of the most emotionally impactful moments in the whole game, and that's not exactly a good thing considering it's entirely reliant on investment in the previous game, but still, it's a good scene in a Cassandra story. Eivor is just also here. The last mission of the DLC is a party, a night of drinking and revelry as Eivor and Cassandra accidentally crash a wedding, and it's the sort of delightful fluff that made the NPCs of Odyssey so endearing. The kind of fluff that's missing from Valhalla. Cassandra teaches Eivor how to swear in Greek, Eivor teaches Cassandra how to fight, but in the end Cassandra slips away without saying goodbye, knowing that she can't ever stay in one place too long. It's not exactly a necessary part of Cassandra's story, but it is a really good part, a middle chapter between the end of Odyssey and her showing up in Atlantis to give Layla the staff. I can't imagine the whole thing has any impact at all if you haven't played Odyssey, or if you were in the unfortunate majority of players who chose Alexios, but that's what the fun of a crossover is all about. It's genuinely my favourite part of the game, and that's damning with faint praise, but I'm not going to lie about it, especially in the face of the third biggest and most disappointing paid DLC expansion. Dawn of Ragnarök is supposed to be the big DLC. It was sold separately from the Season Pass for the same price as the Season Pass, so you would imagine that it's bigger and better than both of the other paid DLC expansions combined, right? It isn't actually, it's maybe an hour or two longer than one of them, and frankly, it's much worse than either of them. The name, Dawn of Ragnarök, sets up some expectations for this DLC. Ragnarök is a pretty well-defined event in Norse mythology, as well as anything can be defined in Norse mythology anyway. There's a lot of cool stuff that's supposed to happen. But this is, of course, yet another dead dove in a paper bag. It's really boring. I don't know what I expected. Unfortunately, the title of the DLC is extremely literal. This is not actually about Ragnarök, it's about the dawn of Ragnarök. The things that directly precede Ragnarök, but not the actual event itself. So it's not actually an epic heavy metal Norse apocalypse, it's 6 to 8 hours of wandering around a big field talking to dwarves. There's a shocking lack of creativity on display in this DLC, especially compared to the Fate of Atlantis, and even compared to the heavy sections of the base game. It seems like they used all of their good ideas in Asgard and Jotunheim because Svartalheim is one of the most truly boring fantasy realms I've ever seen. Some of the trees have gold paint on them, some of the mountains are made of gold, and sometimes there's a big statue of a dwarf, and other than that it's basically just the same environment as England all over again. There is an attempt to mix things up from a gameplay perspective by giving you some more supernatural powers tied to a thing you get early in the DLC called a Hugurrip, but the whole thing is underdesigned and really annoyingly implemented. There's 5 different powers, but you can only hold a maximum of 3 at a time. One of these powers, the first one you get, makes you immune to lava and fire damage and is essential for getting around the DLC areas so much of the time that you really don't ever want to be without it. So you really only have 2 power slots, and really only 1, because one of the slots is both optional and can only be unlocked if you happen to come across a world event where you help out a blacksmith. The powers also don't have a cooldown exactly, they're 1 use or 2 use with an upgrade and then you need to kill enemies to collect their hooker to use them again. So you can't really just spam the abilities, they need to be used very tactically, or in my case, considering all of this, basically never. The plot of the DLC is as barren as the landscape. When I say it's 68 hours of talking to dwarves, that's not even remotely an exaggeration. Svartalheim is an extremely minor realm in Norse mythology. Pretty much all we know about it is that it's either the realm of the dwarves or the Dark Elves, or possibly Dark Elves is just another name for dwarves. The plot of the DLC is about how the realm has been invaded by Surtur and the Muspels, or fire giants, who have also kidnapped Odin's son Balder for some reason. The quest structure after the prologue is completely open, but also completely repetitive. There's 3 regions, each region has a dwarven shelter, and each shelter has a couple of dwarves who will help you out on an extended quest that very slowly unravels what little of a plot there is. I have to point out too that the dwarves are just shrunken down humans who use the same pool of 10 or so faces that the base game did. Even in a magic fantasy realm, there is no escape from the Clunies. We're not even committing to dwarven politics, we're just doing tangential dwarven side quests. Help rescue this guy's dad, help forge this thing, my god do you have to forge so many things. Because the most creative this game can get with its dwarves is that they're really good blacksmiths. They're the most generic fantasy dwarves I've ever seen. The base game was extremely clever with how it integrated Norse mythology. It took the idea of playing through historical events and translated it into playing through mythological events, with a bunch of scenes that are lifted directly from the Poetic and Prose Eddas, our primary sources on Norse mythology. This DLC doesn't do that. None of what happens in this DLC has any relation to a real Norse myth. Surtur has nothing to do with the death of Balder, and Odin has nothing to do with the death of Surtur, who's destined to be killed by Freyr during Ragnarök. The DLC is going completely off script, and even in going completely off script, it's still going off script in the most boring way possible. The rest of the Aesir are totally absent from the DLC. No Thor, no Tyr, or Freya, or Loki especially to keep things moving. And that's because while the DLC is technically set after the events of Havi's story in the base game, like the rest of the DLC, you can play it at any time. In fact, you get an in-game trailer for the DLC pretty much as soon as you settle in England, as if then is a good time to play it. The game only calls back to the events of the previous visions very loosely, with no crossover characters except for the dwarf Ivaldi. And wouldn't you know it, he's a really good blacksmith, the bestest of the best blacksmiths. There's also no apparent reality to the DLC, nothing about the story has any clear clue as to what it's supposed to be in real life. What is the realm of Svartalheim? What are the dwarves? Are the dwarves supposed to represent humans? I don't think so, because there's also humans in the previous visions. Without these clear allusions to Assassin's Creed lore or deep rooting in mythology, the DLC just has nothing to grasp onto. And in the end, it's all futile. Baldur was dead before Havi ever came to Svartalheim. The entire quest and everything you do is completely pointless, which if this was an hour-long prologue to a DLC about Ragnarok would be fine. But it's an 8-hour DLC where you don't even see Ragnarok happen, so it just feels like a complete waste of time. It's also just less interesting than the actual mythological death of Baldur, so if they wanted to do a Death of Baldur story, why didn't they just do it properly? At the very, very end of the DLC, after the credits even, Hirokin, aka Juno, shows up and tells you about all the cool stuff that's been happening in Asgard while you were away. Loki escaped from prison, freed Fenrir, woke the World Serpent and rallied the armies of Hell, and wow, that sounds really cool! Why aren't we playing all of that instead of faffing around forging things with the dwarves? It's a tease for the next DLC, which doesn't exist. We're done with this plotline now. I suppose they thought covering Ragnarok was a problem because Odin getting eaten by Fenrir is one of the first things that happens in Ragnarok, but they already went off-script for this DLC, so who cares? I simply cannot understand the creative impulses behind anything in this DLC. I don't think I've ever before played a DLC expansion that feels so reluctant in its own existence. Corporate wants another DLC pack for the Norse mythology stuff? Quick, let's just throw something together. Dwarves! People like dwarves, right? Gimli! The people love Gimli! It's an expansion that reeks of live service design. I'm sure it won't ever be confirmed, but it certainly has shades of the Halo Infinite will patch the story and later style of writing that makes the live service model so anemic in its storytelling. The next major release really drives home how crap Dawn of Ragnarok is. The next, and really last major expansion to Valhalla is the Forgotten Saga, a free roguelike mode set after Dawn of Ragnarok covering Odin's descent into Helheim to try and recover Baldur's spirit. It suffers from a lot of the same problems as Dawn of Ragnarok, but it's also way better and much more interesting, and this time at least actually sort of rooted in real mythology. Since after Baldur's death, Odin did actually go down to Helheim to try and revive him. After this many hours in a game, novelty is king, and a roguelike mode is certainly novel. It functions like any other roguelike where you start with a random set of basic weapons and have to collect better equipment as you go, with a selection of permanent upgrades that unlock the more you do. If you die, you have to start all over again, an endurance run. I'm generally not a huge fan of roguelikes unless they're really good, and the Forgotten Saga is no Hades, even if that's the pretty obvious inspiration for the whole thing. But the main issue is how long a run takes. A full run of the Forgotten Saga can easily last an hour and a half to 2 hours, and roguelikes are best when they're fast. What makes it so embarrassing for Dawn of Ragnarok is how much more compelling the art direction is. The realms of Helheim are so much more visually interesting than anything in Svartalheim, with much more obvious and exaggerated surrealism to the visuals. And this is a free bonus mode, not a $50 big budget expansion. Narratively, the whole thing is intentionally surreal and confusing. The reason that Havi keeps dying and coming back is that he's caught in a memory loop. Even when you start the DLC, he's already beaten the final boss countless times, but his memory is being erased, and so he's stuck in a loop, getting more and more obsessed with defeating Hel and rescuing Baldur. Thor and Freya actually show up to try and help, or more accurately try and stop Havi, but his obsession is too strong for them to get through. It's all just so much more compelling than the endless cycles of dwarves, because at least this time the endless cycle is an intentional focus of the plot and the game design. How exactly all of this is supposed to fit into the timeline of Ragnarok is extremely unclear because we're doing things out of order. In actual mythology, the death of Baldur comes well before Ragnarok, but in this timeline, Ragnarok has already started, at least according to Juno. But apparently, Odin is just taking some time to ignore that in Helheim, so are Thor and Freya. There's also even less of a clear sense of how this translates to the Isu and the sci-fi reality. Really nothing about it even makes sense as something that translates back into reality, and there are no hints or indications within it of what it's supposed to represent. It turns out that Baldur isn't actually dead, somehow, even though we saw his dead body at the end of the last DLC and his soul was trapped in a magic ball, but he's pretending to be dead to hide from his enemies, and he's the one who keeps erasing Havi's memory so that he can't tell anyone he's alive. More live service setup for a future plotline that we're never going to follow up on, unless to my shock and horror, Valhalla 2 is on the horizon somewhere.
Odin, I feel you close. An uproar of memories, stretching far into the past. I have silenced you and your influence. but I know you have so much to say.
The very last, final part of Assassin's Creed Valhalla, released a full 2 years after the game's launch, is the last chapter, which isn't really a chapter as much as it's a series of cutscenes that completely fail to tie everything up, leave more questions than answers, and ultimately end everything in a muddled mess of missed opportunities. I've learned my lesson by this point. I would expect nothing less. It opens with Eivor having a conversation with Odin, now deciding to accept that he's part of her and work from there. It would have been nice to actually see that relationship develop instead of it just happening off screen, but I guess it was more important to bond with some dwarven blacksmiths. There are 4 cutscenes showing Eivor saying a last goodbye to 4 seemingly random NPCs from across the main game. Hytham, who's apparently now training the people of Ravensthorpe to become assassins. King Harold, who literally hasn't been seen since the opening hours of the game, but I guess it warrants a whole trip back to Norway just to say goodbye to him. King Guthrum, who was an important character in a few of the final regions and has now converted to Christianity. And finally, King Alfred the Great, who I guess I didn't mention at all yet, but he had the exact same twist as the last game where he was in charge of the Order of Ancients but then let you kill them all because he didn't like them. What is bizarrely missing is a goodbye scene for Randvi, even if by this point you could be basically married to her. I guess they couldn't get the voice actress back or something. The reason that Eivor is saying goodbye to everyone is that she intends to leave England forever and sail back to America and live as a hermit for the rest of her days. Which again, it would have been nice to actually see how she came to that conclusion after the past 200 hours of Vikinging and building up Ravensthorpe. Hilariously, even if you choose male Eivor for the whole game, it's still female Eivor who shows up in all of these cutscenes, which I bet must be really confusing if you haven't figured out that she's the real Eivor by now. The reason we're even seeing all of this is just pure curiosity on the part of Basim, but at the very end we get a little cameo from William Miles who asks Basim for his DNA sample so he can look through Basim's memories, setting up the next game. And we pan out on a shot of Eivor and Odin having a chat about Ragnarök as he tries to explain that it was actually a big solar flare that done it. After such an ungodly time commitment, I can't imagine how this could ever be a satisfying conclusion. There's nothing all that final about it at all, and despite how long the game is, it somehow manages to feel rushed as an ending. Something slapdashed together so we can put a bow on the whole experience. Why does Eivor sail back to America? I have no idea, because we established at the beginning that her remains are in Colorado, and we forgot to explain why for the last 200 hours, so she's going to sail back there now because she's bored of being the main character. It's the video game equivalent of ending a conversation with a shrug. There's nothing left to say, so I guess the conversation is over now. After fully finishing Valhalla, I have a much better understanding of the game than I did 4 years ago. There are some things that I like, and a lot more stuff that I really don't like, but throughout it all, there's one thing that still eludes my understanding. Why? Why is this the project that Ubisoft invested so much time into? What is it about this setting and this character that warranted more hours than they've put into any other character in the entire series? There are people who like Valhalla, there are people who love Valhalla. I personally know someone who's played through the entire game 4 times. And I'm not here to tell him that he's wrong for enjoying the game, but quite frankly, I just don't get it. I have finally climbed that mountain. I have finished Assassin's Creed Valhalla, and hopefully, with the end of this video, I never have to play it again.
Does the term solar flare mean anything to you?
I don't think so.
This may take some time to describe.
Not a problem. Time is all we have left, Father.
Thank you for watching, and a very special thank you to my wonderful patrons for your continued support. This week, I'd like to give an extra special thank you to, and finally, for joining at my $20 tier. I don't care how little sense that name makes, I love it, and that's why it's golden. If you'd like to join and finally, or anyone else on this list, or just support the things that I do, then please consider signing up. It would mean a lot to me, as well as a like, comment, share, subscribe, and ring the bell. To see my entire Assassin's Creed series critique, you can click this playlist up here for all of those videos. We're in the end game now. Or, if you want to go back to my original Assassin's Creed video, original Assassin's Creed Valhalla video, very specific, you can find that here to see how bad it is and how much I've grown as a critic.